Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 46, which is the final episode of GT Masters, at least currently on Gran Turismo 6. This series will pretty much definitely return for Gran Turismo Sport at the latest, when we have more GT class machines featured within the Gran Turismo franchise, from Aston Martin, the Renault RS01, and various others which have been confirmed and which I had the opportunity to drive. So those cars will also be in this series for sure. So this series will most definitely return. For Gran Turismo 6 though, this is more likely than not going to be the last episode for now. And in this last episode, we're featuring not necessarily the strongest car of the entire series, but a car which is one of my personal favourites. We've started with a car that I really like, the Lister Storm, and we're ending with a GT car that I really like, the Pagani Zonda LM. And I actually personally prefer this to the Zonda R. The Zonda R is certainly the obvious choice when it comes to track-going Zondas, and of the two it is definitely the stronger car. I just personally prefer this one mainly for the look. I prefer that old school Zonda style which it has, and I like the fact that it has kind of a reminiscent look of the Zonda GR, although I believe this car actually came out before Pagani produced the Zonda GR. Now, what do you get? Because you don't see anywhere near as many people driving this car as you do the Zonda R. Well, being a Zonda, it's got a strong spec and a reasonably large engine. It doesn't have the same size engine as the C12S or the S. It actually has an engine which is closer to the original C12, a 6-litre V12. Now this is a fictional car. It does not exist in real life, although there have been Zondas which are similar, such as the GR, which I mentioned earlier, and also the Zonda Monza. Now in terms of fully tuned spec, the Zonda is pretty much always going to be an impressive car, and this is no different. 1,073 horsepower, 824 foot-pounds of torque in a car that only weighs 1,150 kilos, which is roughly the same as the Panoz GT-R1, the Corvette C5R, the Viper GTSR, that kind of thing. So it's very well placed. As far as horsepower per tonne, it's, as you'd expect, very high, 933 to be precise. And as far as PP, it is high, as you'd expect it to be, but it's actually quite reasonable. It's not as stupidly high as it easily could be. 680 PP is actually quite reasonable for this vehicle overall. That's 3 PP lower than the Zonda R, which does of course have less weight and more power, so that makes sense. But when you actually look at it that way, considering how much more power and less weight the Zonda R has, in fact almost 100 horsepower more, and it weighs around 80 kilos less, you'd probably expect the PP of the Zonda R to be more than 3 PP higher. And that gives you some inclination of how potentially good the Zonda LM is, if it's that close despite having so much lower a raw spec. Well, you'd be right, because although on paper it's the inferior of the two, and if you're talking pure straight line speed, it is also slower, around 10 to 15 miles per hour slower than the Zonda R with low aero and longer gearing. This car's capable of around 250 or so under its own power, whereas the Zonda R is capable of around 265. So this is the slower car. In terms of acceleration, it's extremely quick, but again, not necessarily on the same level as the Zonda R. In terms of handling, it's interesting, because it would be very easy to assume, considering they're both Zonda-based competition spec vehicles, one that doesn't exist and one that can never race, you'd probably assume they'd handle in a fairly similar way, considering they're based on a very similar base vehicle. But they actually don't. The handling is completely different. I would say that the Zonda R is a much more forgiving vehicle than the LM. The Zonda R is more focused, you have more feedback from the car, it feels more taut, more toned, more of a real track car, if you will, which is appropriate given that the LM is not real and the Zonda R is. Overall, the LM has handling which is definitely more trickier to tune, trickier to get used to, and certainly not the most beginner-friendly of GT cars. In fact, it's one of the least beginner-friendly. It's up there with the R8 and the NSX in terms of how tricky it can be. But the difference with this car is it's not as difficult to bring under control as some of the other cars like the R8 LMSs, and when you do get it right, this, like many others in this category, is a very, very competitive vehicle. There are some race cars which manage to surpass their raw spec. They're better than their on-paper numbers would suggest, and that goes for road cars as well, and that's certainly the case with this vehicle. It is better than you would think it is, given that it's inferior in virtually every way to the Zonda R, which is a testament to how good this car actually is. Factor on top of that this is 600 grand cheaper than the Zonda R at 1 million credits, and the value for money is potentially very good to the right owner and the right driver. Now, it's not without its drawbacks. The handling is the main drawback. It's certainly not for everyone. The handling can be taxing, it can even be annoying under certain circumstances, but when you learn to drive the car, learn its foibles and how to counteract them, it can be a very, very dependable machine, and one which can definitely win plenty of races on multiple track types, from technical to extremely high speed, because although the top speed isn't the best in the category, it gets there so quickly that it's still highly competitive even on higher speed tracks. And although 250 miles per hour isn't quite as quick as some, it's still more than enough for the vast majority of tracks on the game. Now overall, I'd recommend this car to someone who fancies something a little bit different. Maybe you've already got the Zonda R in your garage and you want to try something new. This car is not just a copy of the Zonda R, it's far from it. It is a completely different vehicle, and I definitely recommend giving this car a shot. So that's it overall for this particular series, and on Friday we'll be beginning a brand new series based on a category of vehicle which I know a lot of you guys have been vocal about wanting to see reviews for: touring cars. So be sure to tune in for that, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.